Of course, it all happened in our lifetime, beginning in, say, 1949. So you may not have been fully aware of it, but it all happened during your lifetime. So when you come again on Thursday, we can relive the 60s and the 70s and have fun. Again, thank you very much for coming. And I want you to realize in a way how privileged you are to be able to attend out of your own free will. Because this year, when we celebrate the centennial of the Communist Party, all Chinese people are required to attend lectures on the history of the Communist Party. And they will have to write exams on it. And not just anyone or everyone, but all organizations, factories, academic institutions. So it's a real indoctrination into the Communist Party, the history of the Communist Party, according to the present leader. Because Mao also wrote a history, the 50th anniversary of history. And some radical Orthodox Marxists say he completely distorted the history. So we'll see. But to make sure that there are no distortions of this particular history of the Communist Party, the party has also ruled that you must report anyone who has different ideas, disagreements about the official Orthodox version of the Communist Party. And to top it off, they have also introduced a new resolution, and it's called the Chinese National Security Education Day, to focus on fighting illegal religions. Now, what might be an illegal religion? Well, of course, it's certainly Christianity. And it's particularly the Church of God Almighty, which is being severely persecuted for the last 10 years, but it's specifically now. It's also May 4th, and that's a very significant day in the life of China. As a matter of fact, Mao made it an official holiday when he came to power in 1949. Now, I'm not sure if they are still celebrating May 4th. However, I tried to find out on Google who is celebrating May 4th today. And it's all the fans of Star Wars. It's Star Wars Day today. Well, I'm not going to talk about fiction. I'm going to talk about stars, communist stars, who fought real wars, guerrilla wars, civil wars, wars of aggression. So it's a whole range, so this is a bit more of a real history. The communists, by the way, they celebrate May 4th because they claim that they brought about modernization. China, up until 1949, was backward, agrarian. Now, to some extent, of course, that's true, but that's not the whole picture.
In America?
Because modernization started way earlier. It started in the 1860s with, of all people, Empress Dowager, whose book is displayed here, and autobiography on her. And I also had a very negative impression of the Empress, but after reading that book, I began to realize that she was the Queen Victoria of China. That's how major an impact for 40, 50 years she had, especially on the modernization, opening trade, commerce, education, sending students, Chinese students, to the West to be educated. And also began to gradually introduce the shift from an emperor, gradual introduction to more democratic phenomenon, but of course she never really lived to see that. In this explanation of modernization, there are competing ideologies, competing isms. They each claim to have major contributions. And I just want to highlight these views, the different views, which are competing for the claim to brought about modernization. And of course, there's first of all the Christian contribution, the Reformation. Missionaries, started going to China in 1820s, 1840s, and the major wave after 1860s. And the largest wave of missionaries was actually after 1928, interestingly enough. And when they were kicked out in 1949, actually in 1928 already, were 6,000 missionaries, representing 160 different denominations. And the Christians established 1,766 elementary and Christian schools, high schools, 5 universities. I'm mainly talking about the Protestants. The Catholics established their own Christian universities. Okay? So they made a major contribution. But in fact, missions, the missionaries really had a broad view of missions. They saw missions as a way of life, and that's why medical missions was very prominent. There was already a medical Chinese missionary society established in 1830s. And by 1920s, 75% of the nurses were trained in these Christian hospitals. There were 70% of the Chinese people were actually using these hospitals. And you may have heard the name of Nelson Bell, the father-in-law of Billy Graham. Well, he was a medical doctor in 1920s, and he ran the largest Presbyterian hospital in the whole world in China, which is still a respected, if not revered, place. "35% of the Chinese people, influential people in the 1920s, 1930s, or at least at the turn of the century, were educated in Christian schools." That's the contribution of Christianity. And then you have the other influence, evolution, the evolutionary view, Darwinism, and American pragmatism. John Dewey, you probably all know about John Dewey, the American philosopher of education, Columbia University. He introduced pragmatism in American public education. He taught for 2 years in China, trying to introduce pragmatism and liberalism into China. And his idea, he had a strong idea of community, so that was well received in China, not so much his pragmatism. And one of his famous students was actually, I mentioned his name here, Hu Shi. Hu Shi was one of those students, Chinese students, who benefited from scholarships which were given after the Boxer Rebellion, when they had to reimburse the Western powers for all the damage which was done. And he got one of those scholarships to come to Cornell University, studied agriculture, and later on he shifted to Columbia University, where he did philosophy as a major. And he came back to China and was part of that May 4th revolution, if you will, and also became a professor of literature. He tried to simplify the English language, Chinese language. The difficulty with Hu Shi, and a very prominent leader in the May 4th movement at the university, later on he broke. He went over to the nationalists, and later on actually he served with the Chiang Kai-shek government in Taiwan or Formosa. The difficulty with his views was, as an American pragmatist, that there is no such thing as absolute truth. All isms, even liberalism, if you're a pragmatist, are what? Tentative. It's more of a process. You never really come to a strong, absolute, self-evident truth. So it relativized, you might say, even liberalism or pragmatism, so the American constitutional ideas. So there's no way that a liberalism which preaches that there is no truth and is just theory and experiment and process can withstand the onslaught of an absolute Marxist view of world history. They know where they're going. They have absolute ideas. So I think that pragmatism, liberalism was influential, but it didn't last long. It was not major in the impact. And then, of course, we have the revolutionary Marxist influence, the Marxist-Leninism. And I mentioned one person here, Shan Du Yu, and I should have mentioned one other person there, instead of Wing Mong, because he comes a year later. But I should have also mentioned Li Ta Shao. Now, who were these two people? And the other person is mentioned here on the bottom under 3A, C, Chang Kuo Ta. and here is his book, Champota, who written a history of the rise of the Communist Party. These three people were all active in the May 4th movement, especially the reason why the May 4th movement was so prominent in 1919 is that it took issue with the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, which had allocated the German territory, the German colony in China, to the Japanese rather than the Chinese. And that really stirred, you might say, the student movement and radicalized it. And they wanted to have an independent China, recognized and respected China. All these three individuals were part of that May 4th movement. Shendu actually was also a literary man, the dean of Beijing University, we say now, Peking University. He was the dean and taught mainly literature and modernized the Chinese language. And then the other man, the person I just mentioned, Li Tanshou, he was a professor of political science and government at the University of Beijing, and the librarian. And he gathered students around him in the library to begin to indoctrinate him into Marxist-Leninism. And one assistant in the library was none other than Mao Zedong. And this gentleman took him in and permitted Mao to come at least to the lectures of the clandestine lectures in his office. But Hu Shi, the American liberal pragmatist, he had told Mao, "You're not a student, you don't belong here." And Mao never forgot it. As I said, this opening, this modernization of China, you might say, did not really initially belong to the Marxist, communists. And I mentioned here under the national leadership, the modernization of China toward a constitutional republic. And that was led by none other than Sun Yat-sen, a medical doctor who actually had studied, I think, at Dr. Nelson's hospital for a year. And he took over leadership when the empire collapsed, and he began to try to institute a new republican government. Not very successful. He was not necessarily a good leader. And one reason why he's not a good leader, he came to America, gave many lectures to win over American support for a constitutional democratic republic. Was well received in terms of raising of funds, but also the United States government did not necessarily support his efforts. So when the Soviet Union said, "Hey, we are interested in helping you," he welcomed also Soviet advisors to help bring about that new China, if you will. The three principles I mentioned here, the name of the three principles were what? Nationalism, or patriotism, nationalism, democracy, and by that, of course, he meant constitutional democracy. And then the other principle was livelihood. You and I, in the United States, we know that better as pursuit of happiness. I think that's the same kind of a meaning, provide welfare, you might say, pursuit of happiness on your own, but also through government, through a welfare program. He died very quickly, but I think he even had cancer. He died in 1925, and then there was a struggle for the leadership, and Chiang Kai-shek, a general, was able to take over. And he was definitely a military dictator, but also a dictatorship toward a democratic development. As a matter of fact, Sun Yat-sen already had an idea of 3 stages. We can't have democracy right away in China, after an empire, or the empress. We need stages, and the first one was military dictatorship to bring about changes, and the second was under political tutelage, say a cabinet or leadership, not necessarily political parties, and then finally constitutional democracy. And in 1946, just when the World War II was over, the Nationalist Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party, actually was ready with a new constitution, which was very similar to the United States. I read it. It is very impressive. As a matter of fact, I know one of the writers of it, Li Sen Chang, who later on, at the age of 52, became a Christian, And I met him at Gordon College, and we had many discussions, including with about Chung Ho-ta. He was actually one of the drafters, and I think she, as American pragmatist, also had a role in it. And then I mentioned the topic of the brainy women behind the big men. And I don't have time to really reflect on it, but it's fascinating that there are these three sisters. All have studied in the United States. As a matter of fact, they all three went to a Wesleyan college in Mason, Georgia. Their father, by the way, I should say their father, Son, he already had gone to a Methodist University college to be trained as a missionary, but when he came back in China, he did not really feel qualified to be a missionary. He went into business and banking, and a very successful businessman. Well, he sent all his children, I think he had 6 or 7 of them. The 3 girls are the oldest. He sent them all to the United States, and they were all trained at a Wesleyan college in Macon, Georgia. Except the last one, last on the list, she also was not too pleased there, and she went to Wesleyan College in Massachusetts, which probably in those days already was, shall we say, a liberal arts women's college. And there's quite a difference between the 3. The first one, Eileen, she was married, she was the businesswoman. The family was already well to do with this. She was the businesswoman, and she married Mr. Kuhn, who already had studied in the United States too, and they were very successful in business and banking. Mei-Ling, she married Chiang Kai-shek. As a matter of fact, I think she even made Chiang Kai-shek personally a Christian. He may have a nominal Christian, but he became much more evangelical as a Christian. And then when the communists took over, of course, she fled to Formosa, but when he died, I think she moved to the United States and was very active in California, to maintain, prevent the Communist Chinese from getting this seat in the United Nations. She died, I think, at the age of 101 or something like that in New York City in her apartment. So she lived the longest. But the third one is actually the most interesting one. She had a forced marriage with, of all people, Sun Yat-sen. That was not necessarily a good marriage, but then he died, and she remained single to the best of my knowledge. However, she was the red sister. She supported Mao. With her money, she supported Mao. And more specifically, she enabled the American journalist Edgar Snow to be introduced to Mao for his book, Red Star over China, Red Star of the East. So later on, when the People's Republic was established, Mao, of course, became the leader and the president, no, not the president, but the leader of the People's Republic, not the president. But she was recognized as a vice president. Nominally, she was not really influenced. So she remained, you might say, red until most of her life. She got the shock of her life when she lived in a big house. And all of a sudden, of course, the communists said, "You're going to have other people visiting your house, staying with you." So she got a bit of a shock when her whole house was filled with cousins, you might say. But the biggest shock was when her private charitable organization, which was one of the largest, was taken over by the Communist Party. Then she began to realize that there was no more freedom even for Christian charitable organizations. So I think it was probably too late. I don't think the big sister with the big money supported them all. She was very faithful, even though they disagreed theologically and politically. They continue to, in a way, communicate, which is very honorable, correct? That's the way we should behave, even though we may have different political opinions. Anyway, fascinating book. I recommend you read it. It's by Jun Chang. You will enjoy it. And then I really want to, having now given this context and background, if you will, I want to deal with the establishment of the Communist Party. In particular, what I call the internationalists. You remember Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, they were nationalists. The communists were internationalists. They believed in world revolution, if you will. So they believed in the international dictatorship of the Communist Party. And we always say, we use the language Chinese Communist Party, but it's not quite accurate, because you can also really, if you want to be accurate, you should also talk about the Communist Party of China. So what's the difference between the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Party in China, you might say? Well, that was the big issue, because the Soviet Union had become, you remember, the Soviet Union in 1917 when Lenin took over, and they claimed world revolution. Lenin and Trotsky, you probably have heard the name Trotsky, they believed in world revolution. And of course, there can only be one leading revolutionary party, which claims to have world leadership in that sense. The best way to of an analogy, the best way to explain this, like in the Catholic Church. You can only have one Catholic Church. You can have a conference of American bishops, but you do not have an American Catholic Church. And that's the problem with the Dutch. You know, the Dutch and the Germans, they want to have their own Dutch Catholic Church. Well, theologically and constitutionally, that's simply not possible. So the Soviet Union, Lenin and Trotsky, they claimed that they were the one and only world revolutionary party. And then, of course, you would have, in different nations, national parties, or at least in the nation, they were not national parties, but they were Soviet parties, Soviet Union parties, internationally at the local or the state level. That's why in 1921, many communist parties were established around the world, including in Italy. Italy also will celebrate there's nothing left of the Communist Party in Italy, by the way, but it was, especially after World War II, had a long influence in Italian parties post-World War II. So that was the problem. Is it one party or two parties? I want to go back a minute to the founding of the International Communist Movement. That's called the Comintern, and it was founded, by the Soviet Union. And they invited students from around the world. As a matter of fact, it was a Leninist university for the Europeans and the Americans. And they also established a Communist University of the Toilers of the East. That was mainly for Asian students, Indonesia, China, Japan, and Africa. There were so many Chinese students there. I think there were, at the beginning, about 200 students, from 40 to 200. And by that time, there were so many Chinese students that began to establish the Sun Yat-sen University, or the Toilers of China, 1925, 1930. And there were about 400 Chinese students who came to study there. And of course, they call it university, but it was all, of course, a party indoctrination into the communist worldview, and to socialize, to radicalize, socialize the economy, reconstruction of society and make it into a communist society, into a commune, what have you. There was a real tension between the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union, because they encouraged the Chinese to establish a national, at the local level, communist party, but Soviet Union officials came to help organize it. And the three organizers of the Communist Party in the summer, actually after the May movement, the first organizing meeting to move in the direction of the Chinese Communist Party was, I think, in this summer of 1920. And the one who was in charge of organizing was none other than Chiang Kai-shek. And there were three members at the original meeting in the summer, July of 1921, with Soviet advisors. And of course, then the Chinese still bought into the idea of, yes, we're going to have a communist party in China, and we're under the communist Marxist leadership. So initially, that was, you might say, accepted, especially because the leaders who I mentioned here, they were all Marxist-Leninists. You know, they were internationalists, you might say. They were world revolutionary people. Chiang Kai-shek, he was of a different mind, especially when it came to the question of, so they deal with the principle, can there be one or two parties? Oh, by the way, the American Communist Party, we really didn't have an American Communist Party, but we had a Communist Party in America. It was completely organized and directed by the Soviet Union, and it was funded, financially funded by the Soviet Union. So, the tragedy and the conflict really came under number 2B, the boring within strategy, to form a united front with a nationalist party. Now, it's one thing to cooperate with another political party, correct? But here, United Front was to form a joint political party. As a matter of fact, worse, the Soviet Union, Russia, okay, now you know what I mean by the Soviet Union, that's that Moscow directed guidelines, if you will. They insisted that the Chinese communists give up their party and join the nationalist party. And that was too much. They said, no, you know, we want a Chinese Communist Party. It's one thing to cooperate with the nationalists to fight the Japanese, if you will. So that brought a crisis. There was a split. You see it under number 3, the warfare within the Communist Party and the party's revolutionary armies. There were losers, the Soviet wing, the Leninist Trotskyites, the founders of the Communist Party, who supported that strategy, including Wang Ming, who was also a graduate of the Sun Yat-sen University. He joined the party in 1924, went to the Sun Yat-sen University in Moscow in 25 and came back. And of course, he became an agent for the Soviet Union. He joined number 2 MIF, Stalin's agent. And they were about ready to take over China. A coup d'etat, a Soviet coup d'etat. The Leninists, Marxists, Trotskyites were ready to take over. And Chiang Kai-shek discovered it. And he nipped it in the bud. And he eliminated a lot of communists. Because they were trying to, have a coup, overthrow the nationalist party, the national government. And that's the tragedy, which of course, as a matter of fact, the dean, the librarian of the Peking University, he was killed or assassinated or shot to death in 1927 by the nationalists because they wanted to get rid of the communists. Now, by the way, that same tragedy happened in Indonesia in 1960s, and we'll deal with that on Thursday. So it's a repeat for performance made in 1960. So the nationalists quickly comprehended what was happening and then eliminated those who were these radical Marxists. We call them the Bolsheviks, not quite sure that is. The Orthodox Marxists, if you will, who wanted to have one and only party, the Soviet Union party, and the Chinese were just what? Stooges for the world revolution. By the way, Mao also wanted to maintain a Chinese Communist Party. So he and Chiang Kai-shek, one of the founders of the Communist Party, yes, we want to work together, united front, but not boring within, trying to take over the nationalist Communist Party and give up the existence of the Communist Party. That was a critical issue. The other priority, so the principle is which one or two parties. The priority is it world revolution or national revolution? Well, remember Lenin, Trotsky, even Stalin to a great measure wanted a world revolution and wanted to have that predominant role in China. But Mao and Chiang Kai-shek and others, they said no, we can have also our own nationalist revolution and then contribute to the world. And we'll see Mao had that particular view. In other words, it's not either or, but we can have a nationalist as well as contributing to the world revolution. Communists in Moscow insisted on world revolution, and you are part of that world revolution. And eventually, if it had succeeded, I think the Soviet Union would have occupied China, just like it did Cuba or Eastern Europe. So Chiang Kai-shek feels very strongly that it was very tragic because a lot of communists lost their lives over this principle, let alone this the priority. He felt that if they had worked together as a coalition but not given up the Communist Party or war within, China would have looked different, if you will. It might still have been communist, but it would have been far more humane. It would not have become as ruthless, perhaps, as under Mao. So we have the principle, the priorities, and the strategy, that's the boring within, and you just heard a bit of an explanation of that one. There was a second united front, not just say against the Nationalist Party, but also a united front against Japan. And Mao was very reluctant to fight that. He held back. He wanted to have the nationalists do the fighting, to the point that the Soviet Union had to insist, tell Mao, you must also join forces with the nationalists to fight the Japanese. As Wang Ming said, Japan is our worst enemy, not Chiang Kai-shek, but Mao wanted to fight Chiang Kai-shek, but the Marxists, they said, no, you have joined forces with the national government against Japan. There's that other point I want to make. Under 3, number C, Mao's warfare not only against these communist leaders, the founding members, but also against Chiang Kai-shek. Remember, I already told you how important Chiang Kai-shek was, a founding member, a representative to the International Communist meeting in 1921 or 22. He held all the positions. At one time, he held all 3 positions: party secretary, central committee, government leader of a Chinese communist settlement in China, and the head of the military. But Mao was very envious of his abilities. So during the long march, there were these 2 armies. Chiang Kai-shek had an army of 80,000, and Mao only had an army of 10,000. And Mao tricked Chiang Kai-shek to go on a march through the Gobi Desert, which really was meaningless and purposeless. And it is even said by Soviet documents that Mao, the communist Mao, and his military killed communist military belonging to the army of Chiang Kai-shek. That's how envious and destructive Mao in that sense was. And Mao eventually was able to succeeded in making Stalin believe that he was the leader of China. Stalin began to call him Chairman Mao. But the leadership and the battle for leadership in the Chinese Communist Party was not secured in 1938, not even secure maybe in 1946. But somehow Mao was able to persuade Stalin. But what can you expect? 2 monsters, 2 monsters. And it's a puzzle why, of all people, Stalin should succeed in the leadership of the Soviet Union for 30 years, the mass murderer, and then Mao succeed in becoming the leader of the Chinese People's Republic. Only God can help. I suppose we have to leave it into God's hands how God permits these things that happen in world history. Changkota becomes disillusioned and eventually leaves the Communist Party and briefly joins the nationalist government. And then he flees to, first of all, of course, Formosa, but then he becomes a refugee in Hong Kong. And that's where he meets Li Cheng, my friend who ended up a Christian at Wheaton College. He went to Wheaton College and became a professor of missions at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Massachusetts. And that's where I met him in 1970. They became friends in Hong Kong. As a matter of fact, Changkota provided him with a room or a bedroom for his family to live in. And Li Cheng came to the United States to study when he was converted in Indonesia. Came to the United States, studied at Wheaton, and became a professor of missions at Gordon Conwell. That's where I got to meet him. I became much more interested in China. And he kept in touch with Changkota. And Changkota had moved to Toronto, Canada, because his two sons lived there, so he retired. And he had a heart condition, serious heart condition. He could die anytime. So from 1972 to 1978, Li Cheng and I prayed for him. We prayed for him. And in 1978, in June, he was converted and was baptized in June of 78 in a senior citizen home in Toronto. So his name is in the book of life, not in the book of death. That's why he's my favorite communist. Even then already, before he became a Christian, because he was a genuine, he really had at heart the ordinary people. He had been a student at the university, knew these professors, was active in the May 4th movement, but he really had a genuine heart, despite the fact that he was kicked out of the leadership, kicked out of the party, came back in leadership. But eventually he said, in 38 or thereabouts, he said, I have had enough. I still am a radical. I still believe I'm a patriot, but I don't want to see that much bloodshed or dictatorship. So basically he washed his hands off politics. So you might wonder, how is it that Stalin, let alone Mao, came to power? And there are, sure, many explanations, but there are two main ones. There's a book by Edgar Snow, The Red Star over China. And you remember I already told you that this Red Sister had made it possible for him to meet with and interview Mao. That book became the bestseller in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. I mean, every respectable radical revolutionary read that book. It made Mao a world leader. It even made Maoism respectable. The trouble with that book is that he submitted drafts, but they were edited by Mao himself, or Mao's ghostwriters. And Mao kept on feeding his version of the Long March, if you will. And Edgar Snow also tried to persuade the American audience, American leaders, that Mao was a George Washington or a Lincoln, and he wanted to have an American kind of a democracy. So that's the ideological, political propaganda. And as I said, that book became as prominent. I don't know how many editions were in all different languages, certainly around the world. The other reason is more political and military. I gotta see whether I can find my notes here. Yeah. When Japan was defeated, remember Mao laid low. He was told by Moscow, you must join the nationalists to fight Japan. And in a way he pretended to, but never really fought and never risked his troops because he was waiting for the moment after World War II to take over. But he was forced into a united front, but he laid low and didn't really have his troops fight. However, when the Soviet Union, when Japan was defeated, the Soviet Union got all the military equipment of Japan, which was in Manchuria and in China. And the Soviet Union gave that to Mao. So he was completely, you might say, armed. 700 tanks, 12,000 machine guns, 900 aircraft. So he really became all of a sudden, not a guerrilla army, but a national army, you might say, to fight Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist army after the war. Secondly, there were communist moles within the nationalist, not only the nationalist government, but also among the nationalist general armies. I mean, generals of the nationalist Kuomintang party, of the army. And they would, whenever the nationalist army would make a move, would alert Mao and his troops, the nationalists are coming after you. So he was able to escape, you might say. There was also corruption, but it was, in what nation is there not corruption, correct? Especially when you have war, military industrial complex. And no doubt, Big Sister, who was married to the banker, they were very well. They were the Rochesters, the Rockefellers of China, you might say. And he was actually even a minister of finance, a minister of the economy. So whenever there was government contracts, he got, you might say, a portion of it. So there's no doubt that there was corruption. And that's the main argument, the main accusation made against Chiang Kai-shek's regime. But there may have been corruption. I'm not trying to minimize corruption. But why would you exchange a regime which is democratic, Republican oriented with corruption for a corrupt regime which is corrupt in principle and in practice? This is murderous. So the criticism that there was corruption, yes, but it exchanged it for a corrupt regime which has done tremendous damage. The United States betrayed Chiang Kai-shek, or the Chinese. George Marshall told Chiang Kai-shek in 1945, December 45, that there was no evidence that there was Soviet influence in China. And he repeated that message in the Congress in February 48. Now think about it, the Secretary of State telling the American people there is no communist influence in China. Even the head of the US mission in a province in China cabled back, communism is international. The United States also forced Chiang Kai-shek into a ceasefire. Just when the nationalist armies were about to, say, succeed in destroying the communist armies, the United States insisted on a ceasefire for about it lasted 4 months, and enabled the communists to regroup and strengthen themselves. President Truman, who really didn't know much of anything about what had happened under the agreements of World War II, Truman said, the United States has no interest in Asia. China is not within our sphere of influence. After all these years, century of good American-Chinese relations, that America has no interest in maybe Japan, trying to reform Japan. However, of course, reality hit, because when the Korean War broke out, Truman had to sing a different song. And now he saw the threat of Chinese imperialism, or communist imperialism. It's interesting that when the nationalist government and the nationalist army fled to Taiwan, Formosa, they did not burn everything down. They did not destroy the cities. They did not destroy the military equipment. They took the military equipment with them, but there was no scourge of the earth policy. There was no destruction to inherit. There was no wasteland to inherit. As a matter of fact, when the Chinese took over, the communists took over in 1949, there were 1,000 factories continually ready to produce whatever was necessary. There was no destruction of the industrial base of China like we had done in Germany. You know, we destroyed the industrial base and we let the Russians take all the industrial equipment from Czechoslovakia into Moscow. So yeah, the Chinese came to power. The communists came to power. The Maoists came to power. And this, somebody's written a trilogy, a series of 3 books, and they're listed, I think, on the bottom of your outline. Frank de Kader, he's a professor at the university in London, I think, but also is a professor in Hong Kong University. And there was a moment of time when I was able to get these original documents of what all was happening. In other words, he has the first-hand evidence, he has the documents, and he wrote 3 books. The Tragedy of Liberation, the copy is right there in front of us, The Tragedy of Liberation, Mao's Great Famine, and then the Cultural Revolution. So when Mao came to power, he immediately destroyed the economy. He took away, the CEOs, you might say, of these companies. A lot of intellectuals and business people, they committed suicide. And of course, inflation was rampant too, so it was tremendous problems. But actually, instead of taking it over, Mao basically began to destroy this capitalist structure because Mao's slogan was destroy, destroy, destroy. The old, if you will. So, ironically, they inherited all that industrial infrastructure and then they destroyed it because it was capitalist, only to have to rebuild it. The tragedy of liberation, how people were, mistreated, tortured, whatever. And also not only in the cities, in the urban cities, the industrial cities like Shanghai. You remember the Red Sisters? She had to have people in her home, and they took away her charitable organization. At least that's an independent charitable organization. But then in 1957, Mao, he had a dispute with the Soviet Union, and he wanted to break with the Soviet Union, which we'll deal with on Thursday. He wanted to catch up, having destroyed the industrial base. Now he wanted to catch up and make a great leap forward and surpass Britain. Say by, this is what, 49, within 50 years. So, surpass. And he brought about this great leap forward, but tragically, he forced people, peasants, in the rural areas to produce their own steel in these little pots. I don't know if you've ever seen these pictures, if you will. And these people, of course, these rural people who were actually farmers, who normally farm all day, they were so busy contributing to the great leap forward of industrialization that they had no time to work on the farm, or were that tired for farming. So even agriculturally, there was an agricultural destruction, you might say. The land that the owners, you might say, of the land, agriculture, they were taken away, and the peasants just took over. Tragedies, such a tragedies. Such a starvation in 1959, 1960. It's estimated that there maybe have been 25 to 30 million who died of the starvation. And then the other great tragedy, of course, is the Cultural Revolution. Mao, continually, as a matter of fact, Mao believed in continuous revolution. So in 1949, from 1949 to 76 when he died, during that time there were 35 other minor revolutions, new thought control, new ideas, indoctrinating the people again in new ways, new strategies. The Cultural Revolution started in 1966 to 1976, and it was a total disaster. If you may or may not remember, the idea was to send the intellectuals, the well-educated, to learn from the masses in the countryside. So she sent all those students and professors to the countryside and had to work on the farms of Europe with very little equipment. Again, another 30 to 40 billion people may have died during that Cultural Revolution. So if you add it up, from 1949 to 78, when the modernization of the Deng took over, maybe 70 million people died of all this communist liberation. It's turned out to be such a tragedy, such a destruction of industry, agriculture, let alone culture. There was a revolution in 1860, the Taipei Rebellion was called, and it started by somebody who was actually rejected by a Methodist missionary. That particular individual wanted to be baptized as a Christian, as a Methodist, but the missionary didn't think much of him, and he started this Taipei Rebellion, and he claimed to be a brother of Jesus. Mao claims to be Jesus, the great Savior, or is proclaimed that way at least, by Edgar Snow and others. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900 was a rebellion of what they called them, the Boxers, because they were, they were boxers in that sense. But the movement was called the Movement of the Righteous and the Harmonious Society. Well, Mao, in my estimation, is an unrighteous man, and certainly brought not harmony, but chaos and the continual destruction. So for me, Mao is a great monster of the 20th century. He and Stalin, let alone Hitler, all three, to me, embody lawlessness. As a matter of fact, both Lenin and Lenin and Mao said that Lenin said he was a man of lawlessness. Mao said there were no limits to him. There were no lawful limits to him in terms of what he could do. And even as a student already, when he was probably, 20, in his 20s, he already had said, there's no morality which restricts me. I will not bound by any concern for the other person. I will do my own will. So to me, Mao, in that sense, was a nihilist. It's ironic that, remember the indoctrination of the new history by the present president of China? It talks and warns against historical nihilists, those who have distorted views of Marxism, Leninism, and the history of communism in China. So he tells the Chinese people to report them, if you will. I think of all people, and by the way, I think Mao, as far as I'm concerned, is the great nihilist. And I'm not the only one who says this, because who is she? You remember this liberal pragmatist? He took issue with Mao, and he says that Mao ultimately is ahistorical, anti-historical, and illiberal, which is understandable, of course, from his point of view. Un-Chinese, un-Chinese, illiberal, and ahistorical. Contrary, he's not. So, Wing Meng, the Trotskyite of the Chinese communist leadership, he wrote a book when Mao published his 50th anniversary of the Communist Party, and rewrote it according to what Mao wanted to convey. He wrote Wang Ming as a criticism. He says, Mao, you are not a communist. You're anti-Leninist. So he got it from both directions. Mao got it from the liberals, as well as from the communists, the Orthodox communists. So, yeah. I've been basically dealing, say, with, to some extent, with Mao within China and the leadership of Mao within the Communist Party and how he rose to power because of England getting in favor of Stalin. Thursday, we're going to deal with Maoism. How Mao was able successfully to gradually, and that's what Wang Ming accused him of, he says he gradually began to ignore Marxist-Leninism. First it was Marxist-Leninism, then it became Marxist-Leninism-Stalinism, and then it became Marxist-Leninism-Stalinism, Maoism. But at the 50th anniversary, Mao was able to make it just Maoism. So this book by Julie Love is a whole book on the influence of Maoism as an ism on world revolution, including the United States, because Mao and the communists also had an influence in the United States, especially among the Black Panthers in the 1960s and the more radical students. I mean, I read Mao's book, the little red book, Mao's sayings. So I hope I have been able to cover a little bit broadly that highlights. I didn't mean to lecture. I hope I'm just giving a bit of a talk. And now it's your time to ask any questions. Yes?
What happened, wasn't Truman had odds with MacArthur? MacArthur wanted to go all the way to the river. How do you think, what might have happened?
Can you repeat the question for him, Phil?
Yeah.
Thanks.
There was a difference between President Truman and MacArthur, General MacArthur, remember, who involved in the Korean War. And what do I think of that? And of course, it's just my personal point of view. A lot of my friends and colleagues don't think much of MacArthur as a person, that he was a very difficult person. Well, at that level, who isn't? Anyway, however, you remember when the Korean War broke out, Mao already early on told the leader of the North Korean government that he was going to support her. Not only did Mao support her, but of course, you remember he had the military equipment. So the Chinese just sent waves and waves of Chinese to help the North Koreans. And you remember, I've been to Korea, and Bujang, that's just that southeastern corner, if I got my geography correct. There was just a little territory left. And then, of course, General MacArthur came up with this brilliant idea to, was it Incheon? To invade past the parallel. And let me put it this way, if it had been successful, if it had been permitted and successful, it could have been successful to the point of uniting Korea, and we would have had no North Korea. The difficulty with that strategy, of course, is there was no end to the numbers of people Mao was sending across the border to fight. It would cost 200,000, 300,000, 400,000. I think that's what it was, actually, 300,000 or 400,000. Did you know that Mao also sent 300,000 Chinese to fight in the Vietnam War? You don't hear that too often. So I think the strategy was correct. If it had been successful, it would have been a united Korea under a free Korea. So that's my take. George.
Then we had something then that nobody else had, though, like an atomic bomb that we could have threatened China with.
I'm sorry, say it again, please.
Didn't we have something at that time that no one else had, the atomic bomb, that we could have threatened China with, used against them?
Yes, the use of the atomic bomb. First of all, I was not in favor, I'm still not in favor of the use of the atomic bomb in Japan. They should have dropped the first one in the ocean and let it sink in, and then maybe throw the second one if you need a second one. on a different population in Japan. It's ironic in a way that there was more destruction in China and Europe of normal bombing than all of the atomic bombs in Japan.
Yeah, and it saved millions of lives by that.
Yes, very good. Yeah, but I think they could have demonstrated to the Japanese how phenomenal this atomic bomb was without dropping it on two cities within a few days. Now, I'd like to add to that. Mao was very clever. The Soviet Union, Stalin was very clever. He had a non-aggression treaty with Japan. Clever. And that in May of 45, he let that run out, you might say, and only then did he declare in June, I think, in the summer, to support the war against Japan. The war in Europe already was over in May. So it was at the end of May, June, that finally the Soviet Union said, we'll fight Japan. And of course, when the war was over in August, guess what? Stalin got his share of the islands. He got the military equipment, you remember, which he could give to Mao in that sense. Let alone he was able to keep Manchuria. So, yeah, a lot of not only mistakes, but fortunately, the Lord of history is more merciful than I am when it comes to world history. But I'll just leave it at that. But anyone who was responsible, for the victory of Mao, for the victory of Stalin, let alone to surrender the communists to China, under China to the communists, has a lot to account for. Anyone else? Thank you very much for coming, and for those who were listening. As I said, there's a free lecture. You're not going to have an exam like the official Communist Party insists that you will report back and you have an exam and you will be indoctrinated more and more. Treasure what you have, because that cultural revolution which was happening in China is also happening in the United States. And even though China had a lot of missionaries and churches and Christian schools and colleges, within 30 plus years it was gone. And history does repeat itself. Yeah.
Thank you, Phil.
I'll refer to Canada in my next lecture, because Canada is already far gone when it comes to the Cultural Revolution in Canada. So, thank you very much, and I hope you come back because I need a few people.